At the time of federation, both Melbourne and Sydney were around about 500,000 people each. 100 years later, at the Sydney Olympics, Sydney had expanded to such an extent that its population was 700,000 more than Melbourne. Sydney was 4.1 million, Melbourne was 3.4 million. But then something quite extraordinary happened. In the first decade of the 21st century, Melbourne started to catch up, to grow faster than Sydney. And in fact, by 2010, the difference was down to 500,000. And when the results of the 2011 census are released in June of this year, the Australian Bureau of Statistics has decided to redefine Melbourne. Melbourne is actually a physically bigger city than previously thought. The result is that the difference between Melbourne and Sydney will then be down to 400,000. And of course, it prompts the question of why Melbourne has, after 100 years, started to catch up to Sydney. And I think it comes down to strategic planning and visioning that applied to both cities in the 1990s. In the 1990s, Melbourne provisioned for broadacre residential land, new areas of development in the west and in the north, whereas Sydney at this time was declared to be filled up. As a consequence, Melbourne offers the suburban dream, a cheap house and land package. You can buy a 3-bedroom brick veneer home in Melbourne's Werribee for $300,000. In Sydney's Kellyville, in the northwest sector, these prices start at $400,000. There's a $100,000 premium to get into the same sort of property in Sydney. It's almost as if Melbourne appeals to average Australians and to suburbanists, if you like, whereas Sydney appeals to a very different market, a closed market, more exclusive market, if you like. Melbourne has always celebrated suburbia. Edna Everage came from Melbourne's Moonee Ponds. Kath and Kim come from Fountain Gate on the edge of Melbourne. The Sullivans came from Melbourne. Neighbours, the television series, of course, is shot in South Vermont in Melbourne. When you think about it, what does Sydney have to offer? How does Sydney celebrate its suburbia? The best that Sydney had to offer, I think, was the 1970s soap Number 96, which was in fact filmed in Woollahra in those wicked eastern suburbs. So Sydney really doesn't celebrate suburbia. How would Melbourne, for example, expand from 4 million to 5 million or 6 million? I think the way you would actually do that is by containerising the city. Take jobs out of the CBD from state, federal government departments and seed them in suburbia. Take jobs out of Melbourne CBD and put them in places like Footscray, Broadmeadows, Box Hill, Ringwood, Frankston and Dandenong. That way people could organise their lives to live and work closer in the same precinct, if you like. Live, work, play, recreate, go to university, go to hospital, all within the local area. The idea of living on the city edge and commuting to the city centre is a very 19th century logic. It simply does not stack up in the 21st century, and especially if petrol, for example, was to go to $2 a litre in today's terms, let alone $4, $5, $10 a litre. The whole logic of Melbourne and Australian cities in general would break down. The Victorian government actually kicked this off 2 or 3 years ago with the decentralisation of the Transport Accident Commission out of Exhibition Street to the regional city of Geelong. 650 jobs came out of the CBD of Melbourne, made no difference to the Melbourne CBD, but actually electrified Geelong in the process. I'm suggesting let's not decentralise jobs further to regional cities, decentralise jobs to suburban regional centres, and that way you would actually create a more livable environment. A bigger city could then happily operate with people living, working and playing all within the local area. Another advantage, for example, of decentralising jobs out of the CBD to, say, Footscray in Melbourne's west, is that you would then obviate the need for a whole workforce to cross the Yarra. The crush on the Westgate Bridge at the moment would then be alleviated. It saves on building a new bridge or a tunnel, for example. In my view, this is simply a far better way to organise our city.